Okay, so again, get started just so that, when I have to say about that, I would love time to say. As I was trying to think about this morning and what, and how I was living, I was thinking about, I've been to, the service with Eugene Road. So I was saying, I've been watching all the, activities in England with the death of Elizabeth. And that's, I don't think this one. Then there's all the news about the refugees who were just shipped to the Palestinian. And then the situation in Ukraine. And just not happy thoughts anywhere. So this is what Paul Psalm 57. In the shadow of thy wings, O God, I will take refuge to the storms of destruction pass by. That's right. We are sad, Lord. Our world is turning upside down. All around us, people are snarling at one another. Our cloud is topsy-turvy, and friends are dying. And the wind. If we turn to thee in our sorrow, may we find peace in your unfailing love. Amen. Is there any news of thankfulness that we need to share? I hope that's good news. I don't have any announcements. It makes sense. Okay, well, the case with travelers, the reminders from some of you and the news from some of you will be going to the joint school of Science and Engineering on Wednesday at 11:30. If you don't know anything about NO, you will at the end of this. You will have a special speaker for our orientation section, and she's going to share with us how nanoscience and nanoengineering were used in the development of the coding. So if you are especially interested in medicine and how some of this may be applied to our health now in the future, and they should want to attend this. And if you have a grandchild, a child that's interested in science or engineering, in any of the fields, we would like to have them join us. This is a school for graduate programs at the master's and PhD level, and it's all research. And there's going to be some fascinating equipment that we'll be able to see. Some of it is unique and unavailable in this room. Southeast space. So there's quite a bit of money invested in this company, and many companies are partnered with the joint school for trying to apply some of the research to their own products and whatever it is. So we hope you'll join us. You just let me know today. Or send me an email even though it will be in the reports. We have to give a channel tomorrow. We can fudge a little bit for those that are, inclined to forget. So we'd love to have you with us, and would also like for you to keep in the back of your mind November 1st. In case you travelers will be going to Mount Airy for the day, $75. That includes transportation and admissions on all of your things. So if you are anywhere to stay there, it's certainly an event you'll enjoy, but what these things mean other than just standing to the beautiful grand. So you'll be receiving more information, but you're getting the heads up. because you can join us Wednesday. Yes. After lunch, I mean, after the, with the joint school, we'll be going to the, United House of Prayer. And they have a kitchen in the basement. It's called Madison Kitchen Cafeteria. So it's quite unique there. If you've never been, I think you'll enjoy the experience. Several of you have been before, but they're looking forward to having us here. So you get to eat for a little under $10. I think it's what the general cost of being all arrives here. American soul food, salads, whatever you want, they seem to have. So, so I hope you can join us for that. Thank you.
They've done a wonderful job of planning these case and practice. I want to say thank you, particularly to Jeanette Higgins and Knowledge Higgins for joining me in our vision session this morning at 8:45. It's hard to get there, but we did it. We had a good conversation. We more than you've been there, but we hope we represented you well. And now, no introduction. I'm going to turn everything over to Sandie. We celebrate your number, Agape.
That second half victory. I don't know if any of you kept on the television long enough. My mother told me they turned it off because my dad said it was over. Apparently, it's never over. That's to say. If you haven't gone to the joint school, you should go. It's an amazing facility, and they'll mesmerize you with their science. Okay, we're back in our regular way of being, and I felt like, I hope you'll feel this way at the end of the lesson. I felt like I was scientifiking my group again when I was getting this ready yesterday. So, of all the stories in the books of Numbers, there is none stranger than that of Balaam. You are probably familiar with the children's version of that story. After all, it features fun things for kids, a mouth, God speaking out of the mouth of a donkey, and an angel with a sword. So these are things that kids love. But there is a lot of sophisticated and complicated material here, and it's all today about living in fraught and challenging times. So you were perfect this morning. Let's begin with the setup. At this point in the wilderness journey, the people are getting ready to encounter the Moabites. And according to the text, the Moabite king, a man named Balak, is a bit. He sees this group encamping nearby, and he says, "This horde will now lift up all that is around us, like an ox lifts up the grass in the field." It's a great statement, isn't it? Lifting up the grass in the field. But if you are an attentive biblical reader, and I know you all are, you should hear some echoes of Pharaoh at the beginning of the Exodus story, when he said, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are." In each instance, the people of Israel are perceived as a threat by a ruling elite that is not quite certain how to manage anything that might tip the scales of power against him. This echo shares with the story in Numbers something of an oddity for a biblical story. They're both posed, if you ever stopped and thought about it, from the vantage point of a foreign ruler. Why is that important? Well, one reason is this. You will recall that what the Pharaoh and what the king of Moab both expressed runs contrary to the way the people of Israel saw their situation. After all, God tells Moses when calling him to Egypt as a deliverer I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them cry out on account of their taskmasters. They were plotting how to overthrow the Egyptians. They were trying to figure out how to get through the day's work. And they were crying. They didn't see themselves as a force to be reckoned with. Likewise, in Numbers, you'll remember just a few weeks ago, the people in Israel have expressed a lot of doubts about their ability to come into this land. Remember, only a couple of weeks ago, we heard you saying, oh, we wish we had died in the land of Egypt. Oh, we wish we had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones are going to be plundered. Wouldn't it be better to go back to Egypt? That doesn't sound like the people getting ready to lick up everything around them, does it? Yet again, in both instances, we have this story presented to us as worrisome to the powers that be. It makes you wonder what the Pharaoh or what Balak was actually afraid of. Since we know for a fact the numbers of the Israelites are not really all that daunting when you think of them in comparison to the numbers of the people in Egypt or the numbers of the people in Moab. We do know that numbers are not the only source of strength, however, and I want you to put a bookmark in your head right there, because I'm going to come back around to that one in a minute. It is logical for us to conclude that Balak, like Pharaoh, is being used as a literary device in this story to say something to the people that are reading this, which would be the people of Israel, about their relationship to their God. And as we remember from our previous study, the audience for this text is the post-exilic Israelite community. In a time after the people had suffered great loss, after they had tried to come back together again, and while they were trying to figure out if they could hold on to any identity as a people of God, and if it was possible to do so, would it be beneficial to them to do it? That was the question that was motivating. So this realization about the story, here specifically in regard to the story of Balaam, should prompt us to ask, what are we supposed to learn from a story like this? I'm going to argue this morning that our primary issue is in our wilderness experiences, corporately and individually. That is in experiences where we don't feel powerful, where we feel afraid, where we feel unmoored, unprepared to deal with things. Can we figure out a way to reframe the experience and see it differently? In those times, can that shift in perspective help us refocus how we see a situation? I think this question is every bit as pressing for us as a church today as it was for post-exilic history. And I'll tell you why. Thus in Agape, according to the story, the nervousness that Balak feels leads him to seek out the assistance of a well-known, powerful expert in divination. Just as a side note, you might not be aware that in 1967, some Dutch archaeologists were excavating in Jordan, and they were at a site called Deir Allah, D-E-I-R, and it's got the apostrophe A-L-L-A, and it's on the east bank of the Jordan River. And there, they discovered a wall with a painted inscription, and guess who it mentions? Balaam, by both his given name and by his father's name. It was a confirmation that there was such a seer in the world of these people. This inscription dates from probably somewhere around the 8th century BCE. So an interesting little Side note, I have to throw that in. But for our purposes today, what we have to know is that divination was common throughout the area. Now, divination can mean a lot of things. It can mean watching the skies and the heavens for signs of, what God is doing. What astrology sometimes does. It can mean watching the natural world, looking at animals. It can mean casting lots or reading animal bones, what we would say, reading the tea leaves. Or it could mean oracles, dreams, and visions. All of these things were common. And Balaam was known for this. The general purpose of divination, however, was to figure out what God wanted to have happen in a given situation. That is, you were seeking a word from the divine, a word from God or the gods. That was the purpose of divining. But Balak is not doing that in this text. He doesn't send messengers to Balaam saying, come and bring me a word of God. Rather, he sends them and says, hey, I want you to come curse this people. That's what he wanted. I want you to come curse this people on my behalf. Perhaps then I might be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed. It was almost as if he was looking for a way to bolster up his own regime and spread a certain kind of propaganda that would carry some weight. Well, Balaam cursed them, so they must be cursed. A celebrity endorsement, if you will, ancient celebrity endorsement. By denigrating or negating the chances of someone who perceived as an opponent to his plans and purpose. And he is determined. Because even though Balaam, after an initial consultation with God, turns him down flat, sends the messengers back and says, nope, no go. He sends back also another delegation of people that the text says are of greater standing and influence. And he sends not just a fee, but a promise that he will put out there whatever Balaam asks for him to come and do what Balak wants him to do. He thinks resources can buy him a curse. According to this account, however, Balaam is a rather straight up guy. He makes it clear, not once, not twice, but oh my gosh, multiple times. He can only do what God allows and say what God tells him to say. Number two, he consults with God every time before he opens his mouth. And number three, he only sets off to go back with his delegation. One side says, okay, go, but only tell them what I tell you. So he's out of the dog, and he sets out. This is where the story gets long. After telling Balaam to go with the emissary, only to be certain to follow God's instructions, we read this. God's anger was kindled because he was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as Balaam's adversary. You have to go, what's going on here? God says go, and then God goes, no. You might not think of this link initially, but once again, you have to go back to Moses. Does anybody remember after the burning bush, when Moses takes off to go back to Egypt, what happens on that first night? God tries to kill him. Text says God tries to kill Moses, and his wife Zipporah steps in and makes sure that everybody's circumcised, and that covers it, and they do go on. Nobody remembers that story. It's almost like, gee, God, thanks. Balaam, by comparison, gets off rather easy. What happens in Balaam's case is the diviner, Balaam, remains at least for a little while unaware that his donkey is not judging his behavior. You might remember this story. The donkey at first veers off of the road because it sees an angel standing there with a drawn sword. So it veers off the road, and Balaam's like, what is this donkey doing? And it hits him back on the road. In the second case, there is a narrow passage near a vineyard with a wall, and the donkey, trying to avoid the angel, gets near the wall, and Balaam scrapes his foot. And so Balaam is just beating that donkey, going, come on, what are you doing? And then the third time, when the donkey couldn't get by, the donkey just lays flat down in the road. I saw somebody walking a dog the other day. The dog did exactly that, just laid flat down. It's like, I'm done. And that's what Balaam was confronting here. Donkey just laid down in the road, won't go anywhere. And Balaam is angry now, because Balaam doesn't know what's going on. But the stakes are really high for Balaam, because the word for adversary used here, wait for it, is Satan. Do you hear it? That's the word in Hebrew that eventually becomes, in a few cases, only a few cases in the Hebrew Bible, the proper noun, Satan. That's why we say Satan means an adversary. So, what are we supposed to do with that? As with the story of Moses, we see God striking out directly against a person who is responding to God's instructions. And God is doing so in a pretty threatening manner. For Balaam, it took the donkey speaking to him in God's voice, and God opening his eyes, so all of a sudden he sees this angel standing there with a big sword.
Can't wait, it's live.
A figure had been blocking the way. Unfortunately, much of an explanation for why God behaved that way. God simply says, I have come out as an adversary because the way is Yahweh for me or against me. Now, I deliberately use Yarok here in Hebrew so that you know we have no idea what that word means. It's only used 2 times in
No, it's not over, but you can't hear it anyway, so it don't matter.
somebody's got their microphone on.
It's garbled.
Okay, who's ever on Zoom needs to quit talking because your microphone is on. Okay. It says, I have come out as an adversary, is what, because this way is Yarok against me. So, the other time it's in the text is in Job 16. God declares, Job declares, excuse me, God has delivered me up to the ungodly and into the hands of the wicked. God has Yarok me. Typically, we translated pushed me or tossed me or cast me. But that definition doesn't make real sense here. What that scholars can do is say that the verb suggests that God's precipitating an event, causing an event to occur. So in this manner, one's path or the community's path, when it is crossed, when the odds are against one, it can feel very much like God is standing against you. Still, we should notice that Balaam is not angry or frustrated with God or even particularly frightened. Rather, once he sees, he's rather respectful. He falls on his face. He says, oh Lord, I have sinned, even though he's done exactly what God told him to do. And he said, you want me to go back? I'll turn around and go the other way. If what you don't want me to do is move forward, I'm fine with that. Yet the line from God remains the same. Go with the men, but speak only what I tell you to speak. It just feels a little odd, doesn't it? Why is God so mercurial? Before I approach that question, I want to just tell you how the story ends. Balaam does in fact make it to Balak. And in fact, he gets 4 chances to pronounce the curse that Balak wanted. And every time he blesses Israel. And then he has a few negative things to say about Balak and Moab, and he heads back home. Gets on his donkey and turns around. Is there, in fact, a way for the post-exilic community, exalted and dispirited, to hear those words in a way that has real resonance, to rejuvenate hope that God is on their side? I want to take a couple of lines from the blessings that Balaam delivers to illustrate to you why I think these blessings are so important. In the verse, I'm always struck by 2 rhetorical questions Balaam poses to Balak in response to his demand for a curse. He says, how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom God has not denounced? Those queries make clear to any audience throughout any age reading this text that God is not for sale, that God is not for purchase, that God is not, more to our age, for co-optation by kings or emperors or players of any age. If only, you might say. But that God has God's own ideas, and that authentic voices on behalf of God always and only speak what God directs. They don't test the winds and then decide what they're going to say. It is a point that Balaam has made again and again and again in the story. I'm going to give you can see I got 2 pages of a list. I will bring back word to you just as the Lord speaks to me. Although the Lord were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I can't go beyond the command of the Lord my God to do more or to do less. The word God puts in my mouth, that's what I get to say. Whatever God shows me, I'm going to tell you. Must I not take care to say what the Lord God puts in my mouth? Did I not speak to you saying, whatever the Lord says, that's what I am to do? Did I not speak to your messengers, saying, no matter what God gives me, I cannot go beyond the words of the Lord to do either good or bad of my own will. What the Lord said, that's what I do. It's a point he makes over and over and over again. He doesn't speak when he is doing his job. God speaks through him. But we still understand the lure of someone like Balak. He may seem to offer power, prestige, position. Declaring the word of God, by contrast, can sometimes put one in hot water. But this text is about what can be heard as genuinely from the mouth of God, even if it goes contrary to what those in power want. And the writer is saying, Israel is not cursed, and Israel can't be cursed, because to do so would run contrary to what God promised. You might remember the Apostle Paul struggles with this in the book of Romans. Because when he's asked, what's the place of Israel in God's work now after Christ, he has to say, I'm going to hold firm. God's not turning God's back on God's people. because God doesn't do that. A second line in the second oracle, Balak, against Balak, reiterates the point. Balaam declares, God is not a human being that God should lie, or a mortal that God should change God's mind. Has God promised, and will not God do it? Just imagine yourself trying to believe after the exile, after so much destruction, after so much law, while still living under the authority of the Persian Empire, that God was on your side, and trying to act as if what God had promised was still something to hold on to in spite of all your suffering. That's a tough call. Simon Wiesenthal, the Austrian Holocaust survivor, gives us some words for that one. He writes, I once read somewhere that it is impossible to break a person's firm belief. If I ever thought that true, life in a concentration camp taught me differently. It is impossible to believe anything in a world that has ceased to regard people as people, which repeatedly proves that you are no longer a person. So one begins to doubt. One begins to cease to believe in a world order in which God has a definite place. One really begins to think God is on lead. Otherwise, the present state of things wouldn't be possible. God has to be aware, and God didn't leave a deputy. His witness reminds us of the challenge when we are in those deep, dark wilderness corners of ever thinking that there is a way out. Can one hear Balaam's words at such a moment? Even more. Can anybody see God as fierce on one's behalf? Because Balaam goes on to talk about God just that way. He says, God, who brings Israel out of Egypt, is like the horns of a wild ox for Israel. God will devour the nations that are Israel's foes, break their bones, strike with God's arrows. God crouch. God will lay down like a lion and like a lioness. Who will rouse God up? But blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. Can you not just believe there's a God, but can you believe there's a God fighting for you in those dark times? I think you will agree it is a tall order to see that God in the wilderness. And perhaps it is even tougher when it comes out of the mouth of someone who is not from Israel. I add that one because if any of you are good biblical readers, and I know you all are, you probably know the tradition where Balaam is not a popular guy. The book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, the book of Numbers a little bit later, blames Balaam for a lot of Israel's wrongs. Says, oh, he took money for his prophecy. It's picked up in the book of Jude, in the book of Peter, it's 1 Peter, 2 Peter. Look at my verse. Picked up in the New Testament, 2 Peter, and in the book of Revelation. This Balaam as a negative is out there. We don't know why, because I think this story is terrific. He's called God. He's blessed the people on behalf of God, and there's a whole rabbinic tradition on why this thing goes south. We don't have time to do it. But I find this particular memory of Balaam to be powerful and instructive. His encounter with God on the donkey reminds me not just of Moses, but it also reminds me of Jacob at the river Jabbok, coming back home after his many years preach with Esau. What happens that night? He struggles with a strange man who he later identifies with as God, and he comes away wounded, right, in the hip. What happens to Jesus right after he's baptized? The Gospel of Mark puts it this way. The Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness. 40 days tested by Satan. Don't miss it. Jacob, the eponymous ancestor of Israel, has to struggle with a fierce and strong God in his wilderness in order to move into his future. Moses encounters God as a terrifying assassin on his way to be the deliverer and the lawgiver to God's people. Balaam finds his way hedged off by a threatening God when he's coming to speak a word of hope. Not even Jesus can minister until he spends some time confronting the adversary. The paradigm of struggle in the wilderness is so important to the biblical story because the people of God are almost perpetually in the wilderness. That's what life pretty much is. And in the midst of the more difficult moments, God can feel not just difficult to perceive, but downright contrary to where we need to go. Thus, the writer in this story tries to shift perspective for us and to show us that we are constantly going to be bumping up against circumstances and realities and people that are trying to derail us. But our job is to keep moving. Just as the job of that posted billet community was to pull together the tatters of what once had been and create something new. When I was trying to think about how to pull this all together, a friend of mine put up a Facebook post from one of our former students at Appalachian. It was a good thing to pull together my week. She's now a pastor. And this is what she posted. She did work, wrote a piece as an undergraduate on the decline of mainstream Christianity and on the challenge that presented to the 21st century. And now, after a couple of years as a pastor, she was reflecting on that. And she is reflecting on that after being out there struggling with smaller congregations, older congregations, COVID. You might have read about how many ministers, especially young ministers, are burning out because these last few years have been so very difficult on what they felt called to do. But listen to what she said. She says, usually when the people ask me about my research I did as an undergraduate, they ask me if I anticipate a return to the church or to Christianity or to how the church can address this situation. My answer has remained relatively constant since I published my thesis in 2015 until now. American Christianity is on a steady decline, and the millennials and future generations are not projected to make a radical return to the church, much less to religion, in the foreseeable future. It will continue to decline. After such a blunt assessment, she then said something that might surprise you. She said, we should be looking and finding encouragement from the remnant, not from a majority percentage. We should be asking ourselves as the church why people are leaving, sure, but we should also be asking how do we address the real and important issues in our community, regardless of what our statistical impact in the United States might be. Can we still be the church regardless? In other words, even if we are small and declining, that's where we are. And we have to keep moving in that place. And thus she gave me 2 lines that I thought were just fabulous on this lesson. She said, let's focus on being the light of the world, not the brightest light, and being the salt of the world, not the saltiest. And then she concludes, may our preferred vision for our future not cloud our receptivity to God's vision for our future. That last line just says it for me. It is what the people of Israel needed to hear in the Balaam story. They were afraid. They didn't know in that time if they were going to survive. But they knew on some level God had blessed them, even if at that moment it didn't feel much like a blessing. They knew on some level God had made promises, even if the realization of those promises seemed almost impossible. And in the struggle, they had to remember to not let their preferred vision of their future cloud their vision to being receptive to God's vision for how that future will be realized. And that, friends, is no small task. Yes, Judy.
The bad guys are men. Are they really,
Oh, yeah, there are lots of bad girls too. Just as there are lots of good girls. And I'm thinking so next week, I haven't decided where I'm gonna wind up next week. But if I don't get there, remind me sometime to tell you the story of the daughters of the Lord in Numbers, which is a great story. I haven't decided if I can use it in it or not. Anybody else?
Danny Mason, when he was here, talked about Moses, like,
Sephora.
she was pushed. And he said she was black.
That's correct.
And Mary just got hit. So God punished her and the workers.
That's an earlier story in Numbers, and it's really interesting because Sephora is never named in the text. In the tradition, Moses' wife was Midianite, and she's named Sephora. She's the one who saved them in the Exodus. We don't know by Numbers when Moses is said to have been married to a Cushite woman, if that's Sephora or not. Because Cushites are different from Midianites, so we don't know how these traditions met. But it's not just Miriam who gets upset with Moses, it's also Aaron. And so Aaron and Miriam speak out against Moses on something to do with this Cushite woman. We don't know what the issue was. But God only punishes Miriam with leprosy. And that's really interesting because if Aaron had been punished with leprosy, he would have lost his standing as the emblematic priest. He would have been unclean. And so she bears the punishment for both of us. An interesting little fact. Yeah, and that's a little story too, from a feminist point of view. But Miriam, by the way, was and should be lauded as one of the great leaders. One of the oldest biblical texts we have is Miriam's Song of the Sea in Genesis chapter 15. That was a great story. Yeah, great story. Anybody else?
Miriam, named alludes to water, like Mary.
Yeah,
And there's a
yeah, there's a, I think we can play with those names all day long. They're awesome. All right, thanks for showing up this morning. Thank you, Sandy. You get better every week. I like this arrangement of the room though. I do too. And I'm sorry, folks, to come from having a hard time with Sandy. I don't know what else we can do. I'll report it again to the church. Big break on comments. Just want to remind you, we have collection plates in the front, in the back. Since Sarah was not here to pass. And there's also a roll over here. Again, I put in some of them for you, but I got interrupted and didn't finish. So it would be wonderful if you could come check and make sure you're checked in. So in the great numbers of the church, we get credit. For one next one. Anything else we need to say? Okay, let's see the narrative.
May you see God's light in the path ahead, when the road you walk is dark. May you always hear, even in your hour of sorrow, the gentle singing you are. When times are hard, may hardness never turn your heart to stone. May you always remember, when the shadows fall, you do not walk alone.